Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on the elementary planning proposals that were presented to the school board earlier this month. My name is Frank Bellavia with School and Community Relations. I'm joined by two ladies you've become very familiar with over the last couple of months, Lisa Stengel, the Executive Director of Planning and Evaluation, and Gladys Bourgeois, an Integrated Project Planner with Planning and Evaluation. We also have in the room Sarah Johnson, who's one of our project planners, and Robert Ruiz, who's a principal planner. They will, if need to, they will join the webinar as needed. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started, and I turn this over to Lisa and Gladys. The webinar is being done based on a suggestion of the school board meeting, the last school board meeting, to focus on responding to community analysis that has come in over the last few weeks. It is being done as a webinar partly based on a CCPTA recommendation that when we respond, we allow the entire community to be part of that conversation, to listen to that conversation that's going on. That's why we are doing the webinar today. Questions that we will answer, just to go over kind of what we're going to do. As soon as we have a quick presentation that we're going to do up front, and then I'll ask questions to the panel based on, or I'll ask some questions that have come in over the last week or so. And some may be answered in a chat box throughout the presentation that have come in, but we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. At the end of the presentation, we will open up to our viewers to ask clarifying questions about these community proposals that have come in. If we don't get to a question or your question, we will respond to those after the webinar is over with. So I just wanted to get that out there so everybody has some idea of how we're going to do this. The agenda that you see on the screen here for the PowerPoint or for the webinar is to present an overview of challenges and objectives, review the scenarios that were submitted to us during this process, as well as the superintendent's recommendation, answer community questions received by January 22nd about the comparative staff analysis. We already talked about how we're going to answer those questions, and then address clarifying questions at the end that we received during the webinar. So I'll turn this over to Lisa Stengel now, and she will go over some real quick housekeeping things in terms of long-term planning and an overview.
So thank you for anybody who's participating or listens over the weekend. So I want to remind everybody that APS is responsible for long-term planning and taking a countywide perspective. When we finished the last boundary process last year, the request that was made to staff was to come back with a proposal that looked at all elementary schools again. Since spring of 2018, our staff has been considering how to address the long-term challenges, use our elementary school buildings efficiently. And efficiently, we mean we're never going to have perfect 100% capacity, which is one of the questions. What we want to do is get everybody to a manageable size. They may be a little bit over if we determine grandfathering is there. We don't have planning units that perfectly add up to 100% of capacity utilization, but get it to a point where each school really has the room to move and breathe and provide instructional environments that are conducive to learning. We want to meet the capacity needs posed by the rapid growth that especially we're seeing in that Roslyn Courthouse area, but we're also seeing along the western end of Columbia Pike, and that we expect long term down in the Route 1 corridor as we see Amazon coming along, and establish attendance zones that help us manage the growing demand for bus services and resources across the system. We're using a phased approach to address these challenges, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about phase one. This, again, is not the boundary process phase. We're proposing moves that we originally started to look at in 2018. Last year, as we talked about the swap, that was our sort of plan B, and we're back at looking at all schools and considering how they work together. Part of this helps us not only address what we're doing for elementary schools, but also to address some of the challenges in the CIP. We have capacity issues at Science Focused, and the growth. Science Focus sits west of its boundaries, and we've got a lot of students currently in that part of the community, as well as buildings that we know will open over the next few years that will add a significant number of more students to that area. By repurposing the key building, it allows us to actually develop some proposals that provide access to the closest neighborhood school for as many students as we can across the county, maximize walkability, reduce some of the demands on transportation, which right now are a huge challenge as we, have to provide more transportation to meet a lot of the changes that have been happening. Minimize where we can long distances for bus rides, make boundaries that make smart decisions that again allow us to use our budget to focus on what happens within schools, not getting students to and from schools. Again, this is a multi-phased and multi-dimensional process. Just because we've put out some data for this process doesn't mean that's the only data we're considering. This phase of the process it really focuses on the imbalance of elementary schools. We're building Reed and we're opening it in 2021. We recently opened an addition at McKinley and Ashland. Those three schools are in close proximity. They're bounded. McKinley is bounded by the walk zone for Ashland, Reed, and Tuckahoe. As we look at drawing boundaries, we could draw boundaries around McKinley and make this all work. But what that does is put other kids on very long distances going to the schools. And I think we'll see that in some of the scenarios that have been submitted. We're doing long-term planning that sets us up to make better decisions in the next phase of the process. When we come back and do the boundary adjustments in the fall, we'll come out with proposals that are shaped by the 6 considerations, that have input from our instructional leaders that we will get this summer that help us think through the things that, again, we're going to see in some of these proposals. Do we move all the English learners, all the English speakers out of a school and change what goes on within the community, within the school, and what the teaching needs are? We're also looking at capacity utilization and making sure we're able to put our pre-K classrooms back across our schools. As we've grown, we've had to move pre-K programs from our schools to other places. However, there are still students in most of those communities who need pre-K who now go on a bus elsewhere. Our principals have let us know that they do want their pre-K students to start with them as 4-year-olds and continue with them throughout versus joining them later on. I'm not going to go into the details on phase 2. You can read that online. And back in phase 3, we're going to come back and address the imbalance of capacity utilization across schools. Again, we may not balance to 100% evenly everywhere the first year, but over time, we expect that it will get more evened out and closer to 100% for everybody. We're opening a new school. We are again addressing that Arlington Science Focus sits outside of its attendance zone. So the families in that neighborhood do not have access to the school. And every student in the boundary is eligible for a bus to the school, as well as planning for pre-K classes, making them accessible to eligible students across our school system. And then number 4 will help with those transitions. So now I'll turn it over to Gladys.
Great. Again, like Lisa mentioned, thank you so much for everybody who is tuning in. We have received various proposals from our community members, some of which include the maps that we're actually going to go into. The proposals focus on moving planning units to attain the goals of maximizing walk zones. Some of the things we saw, minimizing how many students are assigned to other neighborhood schools, and a lot around capacity efficiency. I want to let you know that all of the proposals are posted online on our Elementary Planning for 2021 webpage. We have included all of the data that has also been received with the maps. We have received maps for some and not for others, and we will go through that. No, you're
Oh, sorry.
sorry. As far as the community proposals submitted to us, we are so appreciative. We have reviewed those proposals, your ideas, suggestions from the community, and as we go through each of the proposals, we are going to share our high-level summary of our analysis, and we are going to go through the questions that we have received around them. This webinar reviews, those four proposals Some of those proposals have been boundary-only proposals that don't include any school moves. And some community members suggested repurposing alternate schools than the ones that we have proposed. I really want to pause and mention that all of the scenarios show a commitment by community members to contribute to addressing those APS challenges that we have posed. We appreciate all of the time, all of the effort of the community members who have engaged in this process, and that engagement is going to continue from us to you, and we hope that we will continue to be engaged in each one of the processes. And I just want to mention that for all of the processes, a lot of the things that you have told us, we are incorporating. This is a summary of sort of the common themes that we saw around all of the proposals. The maps do feature boundaries that aim to, increase the walkability and the capacity realization, which we say as efficiency, which is one of the 6 boundary considerations in a boundary process. Again, this isn't a boundary process. This is long-term planning. Most of them maintain McKinley as a neighborhood school, and they keep all options at current sites. These proposals maintain the neighborhood seat balance across. These proposals maintain the neighborhood seat imbalance across the county. And they don't meet the urgent need for neighborhood seats in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. They do not address overcapacity in South Arlington School as well. These proposals will result in significant changes in the instructional needs of some schools. One of the things, in our expertise, is we have done several boundary changes, and even in our long-term planning, one of the things that we're doing now is really working with our instructional leaders, because boundary changes can significantly have an impact on the instructional needs at a school. We may drastically change a particular school because of the students due to boundary changes, which might have staffing needs. So that is really important, and that is done through a boundary process when we do it. And of course, they don't allow space for the pre-K classes that we will look into in the next boundary process. Another thing that's really important to note when we talk about growth in our county is that we work really closely with Arlington County as we plan for the long term. We use Arlington County data on housing development and birth rates when we work with our projections. Housing development is critical to long-term planning. As we look at the growth in the next decade, we can see, and the map sort of showcases that, as you can see, the growth is concentrated along the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, along the Columbia Pike, and then along Route 1. And that is really what really helps us with the long term as we do boundaries and long-term planning. Now I'm going to go into the proposals that we have received. I do have Sarah Johnson here with me, and she's going to chime in if there is anything more to add. In this particular boundary scenario, we'll call it number 1. As you can see, there are long and extended boundaries for McKinley. You can see that McKinley with that for McKinley, for Ashland, for Arlington Science Focus. And what that does in having those long and extended boundaries, what does that mean? What it means is that it doesn't allow for some students to be assigned to neighborhood schools closer to where they live. And so what it does is that it results in long bus rides for some of the students. Again, because this is a no school move scenario, even in our boundary scenario and a representative boundary scenario, you see some of the same exact things. It reassigns some current school communities into 3 different schools, for example. When you're trying to do this just with boundaries alone without doing school moves, you can take one current school community and divide it into 3 different schools. For example, the current Long Branch students in this particular scenario are reassigned to Barrett and to Ashland. So they'll be going through 3 different schools. And if there's anything more to add, Sarah.
One thing we wanted to note as well, as we looked at the data provided by the community, we realized that in a number of cases, they did not actually use the 10-year projections that we will use when doing boundaries. So in some cases where there might be a perception that there are surplus seats, in the Roslyn-Boston corridor, according to our projections, there are actually deficits. And so if those deficits are not addressed, we'll still have a problem with balancing capacity across a number of those.
So in proposal number 2, in this scenario, similarly, some students would be unable to attend a neighborhood school closer to where they live due to those long and extended boundaries. Some students who live in the Virginia Square area here in this particular scenario would pass Glebe Elementary School, Ashland Elementary School, and Reed Elementary School to attend McKinley. And one of the goals, again, in long-term planning is to ensure that students have access to a neighborhood school that is more close to them. And we have heard that it's so important for our community. And in this particular scenario, students who live in Roslyn are assigned to Long Branch, and it really creates those two islands. You can see Roslyn and you can see down where Long Branch is, and that creates those two islands to attend that neighborhood school in this particular scenario.
Right. We also wanted to add the fact that half of Ashland is then sent to Barrett and to McKinley. So the students who are currently within that Long Branch attendance zone, half of them would stay in the Long Branch attendance zone. About half would either go to Barrett or McKinley. So we really are splitting up the school community into 3.
Again, this is a continuation of the boundaries only, no school move scenario. In this number 2 scenario, current Long Branch attendance zone is divided again and reassigned to multiple schools, Barrett and McKinley specifically, and students in Roslyn are assigned to Long Branch. Here, Ashland and McKinley boundaries extend far east, really far east. When you see it's sort of a light purple color, it extends all the way very close to right in the Arlington, in the Virginia Square courthouse area. With long bus, what does that mean? Long bus rides for students who don't live in walk zones due to the imbalance that we have right now. Creates boundaries for Ashland that requires some students from Arlingtonville to move from Barcroft past Carling Springs Elementary School to reach Ashland. You can see those Ashland boundaries extending right to the south in order to be able to fill it. And then boundaries for the new school at Reed. Yeah, I did say that extends east past Fort Myer. What I'll say here before we go into the alternatives, into the option site maps, is that this is one of the things that we've tried to showcase. Because of the imbalance that exists, it's very difficult to create those boundaries when you're looking at capacity realization. And one of the things that we're trying to do is address those needs so that we can have boundaries that work for all of our students, that are more compact, so that those students have access to a neighborhood school that's closest to them. These are community proposals where they have looked at alternative sites for option schools. In this particular one, for example, they have looked at Nottingham as the option school, so that in this scenario, P would move to ATS, and then ATS would move to Nottingham instead of McKinley. The proposal to make Nottingham an option school would mean moving an option program even further away from its current location. We have heard that, and of course that puts a strain on transportation. We have also spoken with our transportation folks that tell us similarly. An example of that today, I just want to mention, we do have in the middle school, we have Gunston as an option school. And one of the things we hear that program is very supported, very successful. One of the things that we do hear from parents is that it is far. And so this is what we would be additionally making there. Extended boundaries would require additional transportation resources and longer times on the bus for students. Ashland boundaries continue to extend east to Virginia Square as they are today, and then McKinley boundaries extend west and to the east. You can see because of where McKinley is right below Reed's boundaries, and then also right by Ashland's WOG zone. I'm sorry, the WOG zones. All of the WOG zones are so close to one another that if you keep McKinley and if you keep Reed together, McKinley extends east and then it extends west. Also because of it extends east and west because it's bounded by those WOG zones. Move planning units previously moved. Another thing that this does is that it does move planning units that have been previously moved in other boundaries. Sarah, do you have anything more to add on this one? Thank you. This one moves Key to ATS and then ATS to Tuckahoe. In this proposal, it doesn't maximize walkability and manage the demand in transportation services and resources due to those longer bus rides, like in the previous scenarios for some students who are not assigned to neighborhood schools that are closest to where they live. Making Nottingham or Tuckahoe option schools would mean moving that option program even further away from its current location and putting it right in the northwest corner of the county. And it doesn't recognize the reasons McKinley was selected as a location for ATS. The reason why we selected McKinley as a location for ATS is because right now, more current McKinley students live in the Reed Walk Zone than in the McKinley Walk Zone. 43% of McKinley students can walk to a school closer to where they live rather than taking a bus. So what we're saying here is that right now, 43% of the students who right now attend McKinley, they are in the Reed's Walk Zone. So when we were looking at that, we would actually keep those school communities together. That school community, the majority of them would go into that new school at Reed. And the new school at Reed site does not affect Nottingham and Tuckahoe in the same way, because only about 40% of those who attend Tuckahoe now are in Reed's Walk Zone, and for Nottingham, it's less than 10 students, and that's what I mean when they're not affected in the same way.
So let me first say thank you to the community for creating these proposals. What we saw reflects a lot of time, a lot of thought, and a lot of digging in to understand the information that we've published and what's available on our websites and from other processes. The review has helped us identify some additional steps we need to take as we prepare for the fall boundary process, and I'll talk about those in a minute. It reminded us there is no perfect proposal. I want to say there's no perfect proposal. What we've done is looked at a series of proposals and picked out the one that we feel makes the best use of our resources as we plan for the future. This is affirmed that the superintendent's recommendation is the best solution. It adds 653 seats in the Roslyn Courthouse area, where we have already an urgent need for seats, and we expect more students in the near term, in the next 2 or 3 years, as we look at some of those buildings that are opening up. It eases overcrowding, and it draws tighter boundaries and more compact, and it positions us to address future capacity needs in those dense and fast-growing areas along the corridors where the county has approved planning for new housing development. And it's a phased process, so it ensures that we have time to make steps that shape the fall boundary process that build off of this and allow us to address those policy considerations. So I want to remind everybody that APS's mission is to ensure that all students learn and thrive in a safe and healthy and supportive learning environment. If we had no constraints of money, time, or land, we might have considered different options. I keep hearing we should put all of these options in the center of the county. In an ideal world, we might do that, but we have kids who live in these places and we have constraints. This proposal revisits locations of some programs that made sense when enrollment was declining, schools were closing, and it plans for a community that has now grown in the past 10 years by 10,000 students, and we look to see that growth continue over the next decade. And that growth is coming along our metro corridors. I want to give some examples of what we saw in the data that sort of reinforced what we saw. So the proposal actually repeats a hard lesson that we learned in the 2016 high school boundary process. The data provided in a boundary process frames what you get for community input. Some of you may remember that we had a boundary tool, because I'm not talking. Some of you may have remembered we had a boundary tool, and that boundary tool allowed people to move planning units. Almost everybody who used that tool moved Arlington Mill. Moving Arlington Mill would have increased or pushed the demographic, the proportion of students receiving for free and reduced lunch, both Wakefield and W&L, further away from the average. It would have increased the demographic differences that we have at our schools. Our school board adopted a boundary that kept Arlington Mill at Washington Lee because they were considering the policy considerations. In hindsight, our tool probably set an expectation that we shouldn't have with the county, but what we gave to the community was what they used, and that's what we see in these proposals. And we need to do a better job of that before we come back next fall with the boundaries. We will have these things framed out. The proposals pointed out some areas where we need to clarify. So we actually made it clear in our goals that we were looking at walkability. But when we were looking at walkability with our elementary instructional leaders this summer, we were also looking at distances on travel time. So we made that clear. We also have been reiterating what I believe we said up front, but that is clear from the data. People don't know how we're going to do this. Is we have 1,200 pre-K seats, more than 1,200. We need to go back and make sure they're distributed across our schools and closer to eligible students. As our enrollment growth has increased, we have moved programs out of neighborhood schools. There are still kids today from those neighborhoods who are traveling to other schools to access pre-K. When we open a new school and we balance capacity, this is the time to make those adjustments and move the programs back closer to the students and where they're served. And many of our neighborhood schools are over capacity. Sorry, let me go. We actually saw in one of the proposals, we saw a lesson learned from the 2018 elementary boundary process. One of the later proposals to the board included moving Alcova Heights out of the Barcroft school into Fleet. And that moved most of the English speakers out of Barcroft. That changes instruction. Each of our schools builds a team of teachers to respond to the needs of kids. By making some of these decisions in the stepped phased process, it allows us to make sure that they have time to plan for the kids who will be coming to their schools and can again go back and ensure that we're meeting that mission of providing what our students need so they thrive. It reminded me to go back and look again at the boundary policy. The boundary policy, as we put out data in these community engagement processes, lists 6 considerations. What I want to make sure we do in the fall is remind what the opening statement of that boundary policy says. It says school attendance boundaries may change based on student residence to both advance educational mission of the system and contribute to the efficiency of the school decision. I think a lot of the data we put out does not focus on what goes on with instruction in school, and instead focuses on all these variables that we capture. We need to make sure that's much more purposeful when we come back in the fall. And again, looking at this has sort of brought those things front and center. I also want to sort of make a response to some of the questions about option schools. We have heard your concerns about keeping kids when they move to the option schools. And in the next round, when we begin, if the moves are adopted, we will work with schools to help through those transitions. We want everyone to go. We understand not everybody will. The fall 2018 boundary process, we put out data that looked at the demographics of where every student in Arlington County lives. And we identified information about option schools as well, but it showed us something that contrasts with what we're hearing from the option schools. Yes, our option schools show a balance of demographics that looks like what our community does. What it doesn't show is we have several neighborhood schools that our demographics have changed, and we have a much higher proportion of free and reduced lunch students than the students who actually live in those boundaries. If you look at Carlin Springs, Randolph, Barcroft, Barrett, Drew, other schools, they would look very different if we didn't have option schools. The school board policy on options and transfers guides and informs our work. Option schools do help us solve capacity problems as we consider how they fit within the combination of schools. They also inflate demographics at other neighborhood schools. So while we'll continue to value and keep our commitment to option schools here, I want to make sure that we don't prioritize options at the expense of neighborhood schools. Again, it's our mission to ensure that all students learn and thrive in a safe, healthy, and supportive learning environment. As reviewing these proposals pointed out, there's additional work that needs to be done as we prepare for the fall boundary process to make sure that we're including these things and providing informed proposals. And again, the superintendent's proposal, it helped us go back and see that I think we're making the best long-term plan. There are some additional slides. So I think with that, just go to the.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. So we are, as I said earlier, we're going to take questions that have come in And we're going to try to get to all of them, and then we're going to open it up to questions, clarifying questions that we get today during this webinar. So the first question I want to tackle is, how many seats is APS Proposal 1 projecting to open up in the Wells and Ballston area? And what is the enrollment growth projected for this neighborhood in school year 2021 and 2023? Does Proposal 1 meet that projected growth?
So Proposal 1, let me be clear, in 21, we're opening read with 725 new seats. The superintendent's recommended plan for moves repurposes 653 seats for the Roslyn Courthouse area as a new neighborhood school. This is done by using those new seats at Reed to relocate McKinley, moving them closer to more students who currently take the bus to McKinley but can walk to Reed. It relocates ATS to the McKinley site, which has capacity for 684 students, and it relocates Key to the ATS site with capacity for 456 students. So we're adding 653 seats plus some, the difference. I do know that we've seen a couple places where we say there's a surplus of seats. I think that goes back to the idea that pre-K was not included in the analysis. So there is no surplus of seats. We're only adding 725 seats.
Okay, we noticed that you updated the goal, use existing elementary schools to capacity, to use existing elementary schools to manage manageable capacity, including pre-K needs. Can staff please define what manageable capacity means?
So I mentioned this one up front. Manageable capacity is really aiming to get everybody close to that 100% capacity utilization, recognizing if we do any grandfathering, there will be additional students that first year or two, depending upon what the school board does, recognizing that every planning unit does not necessarily add up to a perfect 100% capacity utilization, and there's going to be some variation. But what we want to do is bring all of our schools back to a range where they aren't having lunch at 10 a.m. in the morning, where the logistics within the building for those common areas, for recess, for the library, for the gym are all manageable and really conducive to the environment that we want across all of our schools.
Part B of that question was, can staff also explain more about the pre-K needs? How did staff determine how many seats are needed and where? And did staff quantify these in an updated analysis of students moving?
I actually mentioned that earlier in the presentation. What we actually had on the schedule to do later this spring with our elementary principals is to sit down with them again and review where our eligible students are, where we need to place programs as we plan for 2021 and begin to map out a plan. If we do grandfathering, some of them may not transition the first year, but they could transition the second year. So we have to sort of put that position in place, based and informed on data. I would mention that right now we have a pre-K program at Jamestown. Jamestown is very far north. Our pre-K programs are based on income eligibility, and we have had families turn away seats at that school because they cannot make it there. So we want to make sure that when we're making decisions on where those go, that it's informed by where families live so they can actually get there and it meets the goals that we've set out for pre-K.
Okay, one last part of that question. When you updated this goal, did you perform additional analysis about whether APS Proposal 1 is the least cost way to achieve this goal? Did you evaluate whether a boundary process without programs could achieve this goal? Can you please share your analysis?
One of the things we want to say is pre-kindergarten is so important to us and to our families. In our work with instructional leaders, they let us know that having children in preschool, it is so important to have them in the building, to get them introduced to the school community. It gets them so important. It's so important for them to be there and learn. And it does really give them a leg up. One thing about our pre-K programs is working really, really closely with instructional leaders and looking at where the need is, and then provide those pre-K seats where they are needed in our county, of course, where we have capacity, but most importantly, where they are. Because a lot of our BPI programs, we need to make sure to identify those families and bring them in as early as possible and close to where they live. And of course, see if we can also provide them in option programs. In the past, we haven't been able to do that. And with these school moves, we do believe that we'll be able, that's going to help us get there. The superintendent's proposal includes one-time costs for the moves. It is posted on our website, and then the refreshes at the ATS and key site. And it reduces that ongoing annual cost that fund transportation. And all of this, we have stated that having those compact boundaries not only gets students closer to where they live, but it really helps us with managing those transportation costs. Another urgent need right now in the Rosslyn Boston corridor is that it provides those seats and right where we need them without having to build a school. We can get those seats right there where we need them right now, and that need is extremely urgent. We don't have another site in that area right now.
Sorry for the technical difficulties with the slides. I've just been reminded to make sure that send in your clarifying questions if something that we're answering doesn't address if there's a question about something that we've raised here.
Moving on, what would adopting the proposal mean for the APS budget? I think you talked about some of this, Gladys. What are the costs of moving programs and long-term and longer term of having option programs in different locations? Do we need to understand the fiscal impact to move forward? I think part of this is something you already touched on just now, but you can elaborate a little more.
So as enrollment continues to grow and APS transportation services are stretched, those APS transportation services are stretched. Each school year begins with, with a lot of challenges around busing. And unless we do something different, that pattern is going to continue. The superintendent's proposal aims to reduce the demands on transportation by making those long-term smart decisions on where we locate neighborhood schools. We cannot just continue to leave things as they are without making long-term decisions. And just because a neighborhood school has been a neighborhood school for a long time, if it doesn't work where it is, we cannot continue to just let it be. We continue to collaborate. I just want to make this so clear. It's now more than ever, and being a planning and evaluation team, we work so closely with other departments, transportation, facilities, instructional leaders, school and community relations. I can go on and on to really understand what is the impact operationally overall, and of course, how does it impact the instruction? So I know that this change is hard, but we are looking long term.
Okay. And I think another follow-up question that somebody else submitted was the impact of transportation would have with those moves, and you kind of touched on that. It's the cost of adding additional buses, bus drivers, places to store those buses. So those are all factored in.
I would add that, and Kristen's here if you want to come to the table and chime in, but buses are an ongoing annual cost. We have, if the moves take place, we're looking in our CIP to add some one-time funds to do refreshes at the schools that are moving. McKinley may not need it because it was a recent renovation, and I think a lot of work has been done there. But we would be doing some work at Key and ATS to make sure that it's updated and ready and refreshed for the new school moving into those buildings or opening in those sites.
And we did several of those this year, and those came in around $1 million for the refresh.
Right, right.
Okay, we noticed that you updated the goal. We already read that one. Why is the school move process, which if enacted could lock APS in for decades, happening in the absence of a permanent superintendent? What if a new superintendent had different perspective on how to balance that enrollment?
A new superintendent is going to be hired by our school board. Our school board will be the ones making this decision. I would not expect a new superintendent to come in and change that. This is something that we actually started again in 2017. It got paused. It got moved to the swap. We're back at where we were. 2018, I think we started it. We're back here at the same issue. We know that when we open in 2021, this is a challenge, and if we don't address it now, it is going to be ongoing.
Next question is, I participated in the walkability study 18 to 20 months ago. That study determined that McKinley only met one of our 4 criteria to be an option school. Can you tell the community what has changed since that time?
What I want to say about that is that process examined the suitability of each site. There's a document that's posted online. It's a long report, and it goes in depth into each one of the sites, looking at different criteria. And it's worth looking at that report, because another thing that it does, even in that report so long ago, where it didn't take into consideration, for example, Reed and what it would mean when Reed comes on board as a neighborhood school. We didn't have the Reed walk zone at that time. It wasn't looked at in combination with the long-term goals that we're doing now. As I remember, as when we started that sort of location review, it was at the very beginning, it was at the very start, and then and then it was stopped. We put that out report. That report needed to continue along with all of the goals that we have stated now. Those challenges continue. And again, what I wanted to say about that particular report is that it looked at some sites, and that some sites were considered to be definite neighborhood schools. McKinley was not on that report as being to continue to be a definite neighborhood school. So this is ongoing. We started this work in 2018. Now we are looking at the imbalance. We're looking at Reed. We're looking at the walk zones. We're looking at the pre-K. We're looking at so many different variables and how they work together. And we have explained in the proposals why McKinley was chosen, based going back to those long-term goals.
Okay. In the comparative analysis favoring proposal 1, the only goals analyzed are those originally proposed. Why aren't the new problems created by moving entire schools and communities considered in the analysis? Example, the impact of Spanish speakers in the key community, emotional impact to children and families being geographically displaced, etc. The fact the new issues are created by the proposal aren't being considered.
So I want to remind everybody, our option school families have a choice. They're in an option school, but they also can go return to their neighborhood school at any time. Boundaries are very different. If you are in a neighborhood school and your boundary changes, you do not have that choice. So as we're looking at this again, we're not prioritizing option schools over students in neighborhood schools. There is a balance of how we look at these things, and we're being we're making sure that we're considering all communities. There are families in other communities with similar challenges who may be moved by the boundary and won't have the option to go back to where they are most familiar and comfortable.
A couple of questions that came in were similar, and I also saw some of this online, is in light of some confusion caused by a recent Sun Gazette article that talked about, I think the highlighted paragraph was, but under some community pressure, staff offered a plan B for the school board to consider, one that would push a redistricting decision until the fall. To clarify that, it was always the option 1 and then the what if boundary scenario that we talked about at the very beginning. If we did nothing, that we would have to just do boundaries, and that would create some of the problems that we've been talking about already. But talk a little bit about that, and just that what the idea was, that what if boundary scenario was always part of the.
So if we don't make the moves, if the school board determines they don't support the moves, when we come back next fall, we are still making boundaries, regardless of whether or not we do this. In the fall, we're making boundaries. The difference is what schools are the neighborhood schools in the fall process.
Moving on to some other questions. What is the impact of proposal 1 versus we already talked about? It was a transportation question. Will school moves and a later boundary change affect fewer students than a typical boundary change?
No, I think this boundary change, because we have, we know we have some areas with lots of change and growth, and we haven't done during the time I lived here, we haven't really done and had the school board adopt a boundary change that impacts all schools. This is going to impact almost every single school. I think there's some boundary changes that we did in the last process that will remain and continue. We should be able to completely avoid moving any planning unit a second time in this boundary process. But we need to go back and address what we didn't finish at Abingdon last time. We need to hit every school, and it means there's a lot of kids moving. So yes, the moves actually makes less kids move and makes less kids, it makes kids go to the schools that are closer to where they live physically, distance-wise, but there's still going to be a lot of moves.
Is proposal one necessary to set boundaries without 30% of the APS population? Is proposal one necessary to set boundaries without 30% of the APS population?
Proposal one is necessary because of the long-term challenges that we face, that we have communicated, which is the imbalance that exists across the county, which is that demand on the bus transportation, the fact that our students cannot access a neighborhood school closest to where they live, which we know, especially in the elementary school level, which parents of all communities tell us all the time how important that is. So that is what proposal one aims to do. It's long-term planning. Then a boundary process is really aiming for that long-term, to set us up, to provide us with that foundation that we need to have boundaries that are that help us with all of those long-term challenges that we have stated. So
Does staff expect to move science focus to key if proposal one is adopted?
We know that if the superintendent's recommendation is adopted, that many of the kids who currently attend Science Focus are much closer to key and likely to be in the boundaries. We know there are more kids in that area than that will fit in the building. We can fill 2 buildings. We may be able to fill 3. So Long Branch will be part of the solution. Taylor will be part of the solution, as well as Science Focus and key.
Okay, moving on to some other questions here. Without school moves, will ATS need to continue the current number of kindergarten classes, necessitating adding relocatables each year at the current site?
At the current site, without the moves.
Without school moves, so if ATS stays.
We'd have to look at that. We actually have a process for looking at that annually, and we're doing that stuff right now where we actually look at the short-term needs there. We look at the short-term needs across all of our schools. Do we have enough capacity for next school year? So this year, we're actually preparing to add relocatables to Science Focus, to Abingdon, and to some others that have come up in our reviews.
If proposal one is adopted, and this might be a question we can't answer just yet, will approximately 1,100 students who live east of North Highland Street and north of 10th Street be assigned to neighborhood schools?
would not be able to do that. Again, one of the things that we're doing in long-term planning is addressing those long-term challenges that we have. We will have after that a boundary process in September 2020. And that is when we're going to look at very specific planning unit level projections. And that is when we're going to look at those moves and how they all fit together with the 6th boundary
And as we said earlier, the capacity utilization, we want to make every school manageable within its capacity. I believe Key is 653 seats. So while there are 1,100 kids, I think you said in that area, we're not going to put 1,100 kids in a school that's designed for 653 seats. We're going to avoid that. So it's going to be much closer to what it should be.
Before I ask another question, just want to let our webinar attendees know if you do have clarifying questions that you want to ask, please go ahead and send those in now. I know we have about 10 minutes or so left in the webinar, so we want to make sure we get to those before we end. One question that came into us recently was, might it be possible for current Key students an extended day to be bused back to Key site after school for the first year to assess impact?
One of the things in this phase that we have put out is those transitions. We have there are a lot of concerns, a lot of questions, and the more time that we have for the school moves to be adopted, the more time we will have to address some of these issues. Work with the school communities, work with the leadership of the school communities to address those sort of transition needs.
So I got some clarifying questions here I want to go through. So how will we know that new boundaries will be compact boundaries? They won't all be. I actually want to go back to when we did the fall 2018 boundary process. We looked at Abingdon, and there were some boundaries that there's no schools on the western end of Columbia Pike that we don't have enough capacity. There's schools, but there are a lot of small schools and they're filled. So there are some places where kids are going to continue to have long distance bus rides. What we're trying to do again, though, is rebalance where we can and where we have schools that we can change them from a neighborhood to an option school to make sure fewer kids are having those longer bus rides. You know, if we could build schools where kids were and we didn't have any constraints, it might be a very different situation, but we're using the facilities we have now to make better decisions.
And we would use our upcoming CIP process to address some of those schools in the western end.
Right. Actually, the school board direction has us looking at several sites that we have with these older, smaller schools where we actually are looking to see, is it feasible to do an addition or a redevelopment of the building that expands capacity, improves the quality of the school, because a lot of these schools are some of our oldest, smallest buildings, and makes it better for all students there as well, while also addressing those long-term capacity needs. Again, when we get to the CIP, we have to balance that along with priorities for middle and high school as well. Where the Career Center is coming online, and the funds go there first. I do want to clarify also, there was a question on the changes to the option and transfer policy and how that impacted Key. So the option and transfer policy, actually, I think I recently have been thinking about this. It really was a boundary policy. Families in those neighborhoods used to have a choice. They would go to Key, and if they didn't want immersion, they could choose Arlington Science Focus. When the policy changed, you had to go to Key. Oh, you could only get in through the lottery. So we essentially moved 653 seats from the neighborhood. So what we're doing today is not necessarily repurposing. We're giving it back to the neighborhood because we took it away when we changed that policy. Even though it was not a boundary change, it did essentially take that away.
So long-term planning clarification question. Are we looking to buy land, more land and build a new school?
We are not looking to buy more land. We actually have land we can develop. We know that land is at a premium here. And as we looked at where we can, that area of high growth along the eastern end of Roslyn Courthouse area, there are no sites. The county recently gave us a list of sites that could be considered for long-term development. We're working with JFAC and through our CIP process to identify which of those sites we want to explore, so that when we get to the point where we need to add more schools, the community has already said, yes, you can put a middle, an elementary, or a high school on this site. We've done the process, and now you just need to plan the school. That's what they do well. We know they have Dawson Terrace. We know they have the Maury Arts Building on Wilson Boulevard. They have Quincy Park. They have a lot of really great sites on there. We want that community engagement to happen so that when we need those sites, we can build them there, and we don't have to go through the process we've done, like with citing Fleet, with citing some of the other schools. That's a long process.
Do you know how many native Spanish speakers at Key are from outside the science focus zone?
We do, and it's
Yeah.
published as an FAQ. I would actually encourage people to look online.
It is.
And actually, there's one more clarifying question. Someone asked about the principals involved in our instructional conversations over the summer. We invited all principals, and the principals being affected by this moves were at some of the meetings. Oh, and we just got that number. There are 410 kids from outside there.
Continue on what you were just saying.
They asked about whether or not the schools that are involved in the move were part of those conversations this summer, the principals, and we invited all principals and APs to that work, as well as all of our central office instructional leaders and other departments. And those principals were at meetings. I don't know if they were at every single meeting, but they were represented.
Another clarifying question that came in is, you mentioned walkability. How do you know how students get to and from school? I know I could take a stab at this because I'm working on part of this right now. We work very closely with transportation to figure out how students get to school. We do have walk zones around the school, so we assume that those kids are walking to school, or at least their parents may be taking to school, but we also, anybody outside the walk zones are on a bus. But we do have a survey that comes out every 3 years called APS Go. And that's survey is specifically geared to ask families how they get to school, how their kids get to school. That survey is actually coming up this spring, starting in March. So that's another way that we can look at how our students are taken to school, how they get to school, and that will help in the next round of phase 3 is to do the boundaries, because we can have that data to help us craft those boundaries.
Yeah, I have to add, Frank, because if somebody has not had the opportunity to listen to Kristen Haldeman's PowerPoints, and they are all posted online, she really goes in depth into some of the data, which Frank mentioned, and how she understands, meets with parents, etc. And even more things, if you live closer to the school, how far away, and how likely you are to either walk or, so those are fascinating. We'll work really closely with Kristen on that.
Clarifying question that just came in, given the projections in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, is it possible that you will still eventually need a school closer to Roslyn? It seems that moving the immersion program will not solve the whole problem. If proposal 1 is adopted and there is a large influx of students closer to Ballston, where will the neighborhood school for those students be? Meaning, will the immersion program need to move again in 5 to 10 years?
You know, I think we're watching. We know that we've got a lot of developments opening up in that area. I don't know what will happen. I also know that, Immersion would like, as we're looking at the current CIP, we're looking at, could the ATS site be developed for additional seats? I've heard suggestions from the community. Could we put all of Immersion together? Those are all decisions that we will make at the next point in time when we actually have resources to do it. I don't want to think ahead of this moment because we don't quite know what the situation will be. And that is why with our projections and our CIP, we actually go back and reevaluate our projections every year. We update our CIP every 2 years because what's happening on the ground in our communities is very, is changing, and we want to make sure we're prepared for change so that our CIP builds in resources that can be used, and we get to reevaluate and say every 2 years, are we moving in the right direction? So the Career Center, we put resources in next time, we need that, and our projections are telling us that needs to be done for 2025 to ensure that we're ready for high school students. So I feel like that process will allow us to make those decisions when needed.
You mentioned that Tuckahoe is a walkable school. Do you offhand know what percentage of Tuckahoe students can walk?
No, but I believe that can be found in the walk zone work, or actually in the data we posted.
Frank.
Actually, want to just clarify, when we did a location analysis in the last spring, we know that there are 356 students who are K-5 who could walk, who were in the expanded walk zone for Tuckahoe, and that comprised about 65% of the building capacity.
Okay. After we do the potential school moves and the boundary changes, will it not change for 10 years? How often are we anticipating changing boundaries?
I would say we're probably going to change boundaries. We're going to look at if we need to change boundaries every 5 years, regardless of whether schools are coming on. What we're seeing is families are living in places that they didn't live 20 years ago. And so we need to keep a watch on that, especially as we develop sites that are high rises, and we're seeing some families with children live in those places that we typically don't see a lot come from. They used to be, we still get the majority of our kids from single family homes and then committed affordable housing, but we're watching those other trends, especially as Amazon comes in town and we get questions about whether or not that will change. It will increase our enrollment growth.
Okay. We are getting very close to our wrap-up time for 1:30. I'm just checking with staff to see if there's any more final questions that have come in, and it looks like we don't have any more sitting in our queue. So I want to thank everybody that did participate in this webinar and ask some questions, and those that sent in questions ahead of time. If we didn't answer your question, we'll go back through and look at all of them, and we will make sure that we get answers to those questions. A couple of just other points to reiterate. Lisa mentioned this early on. There's a public hearing on Thursday, the 30th at 7 o'clock, and then the school board is expected to act on the superintendent's recommendation on February 6th at the school board meeting. Again, if you have any other questions, you can still send them into the Engage email address. This presentation will be posted on the Engage website, so you can go back and look through it. You can look at the detailed staff analysis. Thanks everybody again for participating. Thanks to our staff that's been handing us questions. Our technical staff, Chris Brown from Information Services, Lisa and Gladys. Thank you for again sitting in and answering these questions. And we will talk to you later.